It was Christians, but it was Christians who expelled the Jews from Spain in the 15th century, not Muslims. It was Christians who exploited and killed Africans by the millions in the Congo Free State in the late 19th century. It was Christians, Christian Americans, who slaughtered thousands of Filipinos in the so-called Philippine insurrection at the turn of the 20th century after we liberated them from Spain. And then from 1914 to 1918, in battle after senseless battle, Christian soldiers in World War I shot, bombed, torpedoed, burned, gassed, bayoneted, and starved each other and civilians until 20 million of them were wounded and another 20 million lay dead. And what did the Christians at home in the United States do and say before and during World War I? Their conduct was shameful. Challenged with the problem of arousing the patriotic spirit of the nation, government leaders must convince the populace of the absolute necessity of the war, the utter wickedness of the enemy, and the supreme justness of the country's cause. To these ends, the churches became willing servants of the state. They contributed to wartime hysteria and propaganda. Christianity became an adjunct to nationalism. Loyalty to one's country became the highest expression of the Christ-like life. Love of country exceeded love of mankind. God and country became synonymous. To give one's life for his country and its flag was to give it for God and his kingdom. As Christ died to make men holy, so U.S. soldiers died to make men free. There was no difference between the pronouncements of patriotic organizations, government propaganda bureaus, and the edicts of Christian leaders. Religious organizations and nationalistic groups vied with each other in their flowery, patriotic declarations. America's participation in the war was viewed as a missionary enterprise. It is a blot on Christianity that many of the religious dissenters from the drive for war were unorthodox Christians, socialists, Unitarians, Universalists, Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Several members of this latter sect were sentenced to prison for circulating a book by their late leader with this particularly objectionable passage. Nowhere in the New Testament is patriotism, a narrowly minded hatred of other peoples, encouraged. Everywhere and always, murder in its every form is forbidden. And yet, under the guise of patriotism, civil governments of the earth demand of peace-loving men the sacrifice of themselves and their loved ones and the butchery of their fellows, and hail it as a duty demanded by the laws of heaven. What a shame that this statement was not on the lips of every so-called Orthodox Christian. Orthodox clergymen in the pulpit and their followers in the pew during World War I both succumbed to war psychology and the societal pressure just as most other citizens. One Baptist pastor said that he looked upon the enlistment of an American soldier as he did on the departure of a missionary for Burma. A Presbyterian minister likewise remarked, "Every dollar and every service given to Uncle Sam for his army is a gift to missions." The dean of Oberlin College, who was also a congregational minister, maintained that the Christian soldier in friendship wounds the enemy. In friendship, he kills the enemy. A Methodist preacher from Pittsburgh declared that he would have gone over the top with other Americans. "I would have driven my bayonet into the throat or the eye or the stomach of the Huns without the slightest hesitation," he said, "and my conscience would not have bothered me in the least." An Episcopal minister wrote in the Atlantic Monthly that the complete representative of the American church in France is the United States Army overseas. Leaders in the Lutheran and Catholic churches had no trouble likewise expressing their patriotism by a steadfast allegiance to the government. One of the most notable Christian servants of the state during World War I was Ralph McKim, the rector of the Church of the Epiphany in Washington, D.C. McKim made claims for Germany that were never ascribed to Hitler. Germany seeks to control the whole world. Her ambition is to dominate mankind. Her aim is to bring all peoples and nations under the Hohenzollerns. To McKim, the conflict in Europe was a crusade. It was a holy war. Because he believed that civilization was at stake, and humanity, and even Christianity itself, McKim maintained, it is God who has summoned us to this war. It is His war we are fighting. Soldiers at the front were marching to Calvary to meet the armies of the Antichrist. Other Christian ministers during World War I advocated restraints on anti-war speech and writing, the suppression of German-language newspapers, the purchase of war bonds, spying on American citizens, the death penalty for those who obstructed recruiting, harsh treatment of conscientious objectors, absolute loyalty to the government, hatred of the German people, torture of the German Kaiser, a 100-year boycott of German goods, and the mass sterilization of soldiers in Germany. Parachurch organizations were enlisted by the state as well. The YMCA was recruited to check morals, to promote morale, and to make men better fighters physically. Its secretaries exhibited the Bible as the greatest of all war books and presented Jesus as a warrior, thrusting his bayonet through a Hun in battle as an example to others. Even the American Peace Society, whose members consisted largely of Christians, came to support the war. Religious journals donated advertising space for the sale of war bonds. Near the war's end, Christian Work magazine ran a full-page ad that read at the top of the page, "Kill the Hun, kill his hope." In the middle of the page was a picture of a bayonet and a $100 Liberty bond. Underneath this was the reminder, bayonet and bond. Both kill. One kills the Hun, the other kills his hope. Buy U.S. government bonds. We hear much of the same now regarding the Iraq War. And without the massive government propaganda campaign that was undertaken during World War I guess Christians have gotten dumber. When Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, with the announcement that our cause was just, Christians lined up in droves to support their president. They enlisted in the military. They put W stickers and yellow ribbons on their cars. They implored us in church to pray for the troops. They made heroes out of every dead American soldier. They began reciting their patriotic sloganeering, their God and country rhetoric, and their obey the powers that be mantra. They dusted off their books on just war theory. They denounced Christian opponents of the war as liberals, pacifists, traitors, and Quakers, usually preceded by the adjectives unpatriotic and anti-American. Why? Why have so many religious people gotten it so wrong? As I have explained in many of my articles on Christianity and war over the years, there are many reasons. Thinking that the war in Iraq was in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks, believing that Saddam was another Hitler, supposing that Iraq was a threat to the United States, seeing the war in Iraq as a modern-day crusade against Islam, assuming that the United States needed to protect Israel from Iraq, viewing Bush as a Messiah figure, equating the Republican Party with the party of God, blindly following the conservative movement, deeming the state to be a divine institution instead of a lying, stealing, and killing machine, failing to separate the divine sanction of war against the enemies of God in the Old Testament from the New Testament ethic that taught otherwise, having a profound ignorance of history and primitive Christianity, reading too much into the mention of soldiers in the New Testament, adopting the mindset that brute force is barbarism when individuals use it, but honorable when nations are guilty of it, possessing a warped God and country complex, holding a my country right or wrong attitude, and as I mentioned previously, accepting without reservation the myth of American exceptionalism.